Should be right.
Okay. If I just move away, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
He's good.
I'm not going to sing or anything like that because I don't want any rotten tomatoes thrown at me, alright? Okay?
So firstly, I'd like to say thank you to Stavros for coming along today to speak to Saul. You're a very good friend and mentor, and we're very honoured to have you here today, Stavros. I was at this. So just a brief outline in terms of what will be discussed today. So I think there's the various episodes in the late 19th century and early 20th century that shaped modern Greece. However, the impact of these episodes on modern Greece remains largely unknown. Stavros will cover 4 major areas in this interactive and entry-level seminar. These include the Greek-Turkish War of 1897, the Greece and the Balkan Wars 1912-1913, Greece in the First World War, and the Asia Minor campaign and disaster. Born in Cairo, Egypt, before migrating to Australia, Stavros Stavridis is a historical and educational consultant and freelance writer. He specialises in political science, economic history, and European history. Stavros has lectured at university and community colleges, both in Australia and the United States, and presented at international conferences. He is the author of 2 books and has published articles in books, peer-reviewed journals, and in the Greek American press. He was also a historical researcher at the National Centre for Atlantic Studies and Research at Melbourne University. Thank you, Stavros, for coming in today.
Thank you. Wow. To cover 25, 26 years of Greek history is a pretty big task, but I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible. The reason why I've chosen this period is because it is a formative period in modern Greek history where we see the expansion of the Greek state through a series of conflicts and so forth. Now, before I actually get into the talk, I just want to outline a few terms so you can keep it in the back of your mind. The first one is the great idea, or in Megadi Ιδέα. What does that mean? Well, when the modern Greek state came into existence in 1830 at the sponsorship of the great powers, in other words, Great Britain, France, and Russia, Greece was only about half the size at that time. So the great idea was to bring all the Greeks that lived outside of this small kingdom into a larger Greece. So that's what we call the Megadi Ιδέα. The other thing to factor into modern Greek history is the role of great powers, because they played a very substantial and influential role in Greek history. I remember my late father saying this: the foreign embassies were the power brokers at that time, and I'm quoting him verbatim. So, and of course, the other phenomenon in Greek history is the creation of the International Financial Commission. In other words, at the end of the Greco-Turkish War of 1897, the great powers, France, Italy, Russia, etc., Germany, Austria-Hungary, created an International Financial Commission to get Greece to pay its foreign loans. So what we see today is not a new thing. Okay, so we'll start now with the Greco-Turkish War of 1897. During the 1890s, the Cretans were agitating for union with Greece. And of course, the Ottomans didn't really like that because Crete was a part of the Ottoman Empire. So in 1896, we see a revolution, an uprising in Crete, where the Greek Cretans were wanting emissaries, union with the motherland. And in response to that, Greece sends troops to the island, and the Turks took that as an act of provocation. And in early 1897, we actually see the Greeks actually clamouring for war. And the great powers were somewhat scared of this because they also had their own interest in the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to preserve, some of the European powers like Great Britain, France and so on, wanted to preserve the Ottoman Empire for their own strategic and economic interests. And war finally breaks out in April of 1897. It was short war, only lasted about 30 days or so, and the Ottomans actually entered into Thessalia, and they were only a couple of days' march to Athens, and then Greece said, please, to the great powers, intervene. And of course, the great powers didn't want Greece to actually collapse. So they told the Turks to back off, and then we enter into an armistice. After the armistice, they signed a peace treaty in late 1897, and also out of that was in 1898 the creation of the International Financial Commission, which I stated earlier. And that commission was responsible to ensure that Greece met and serviced its foreign debts, because during the course of the 19th century, before the Greek state was formed, and it sort of formed from 1830 on, it took out a series of international loans, and a couple of times it actually went bankrupt. So in the end, this IFC told the Greek government, all the money's coming in, so from your imports and all that, we will assign to pay off debt, and so you can reduce what's called a sinking fund as such. Now, what I'll show here is, and also with Crete, what had actually happened was it actually became an autonomous province with a Christian governor, and the guy who was Prince Nicholas, was part of the Greek royal family, but it was still under Ottoman rule. So you see here, in this picture here, see the people here restless, they want conflict, okay? The second photo, this is the Ottoman army, defeating the Greeks. The other one is Greek irregular volunteers, because one of the things I'd like to also mention with the volunteers, they actually were coming from overseas. There were Greek volunteers who came from the United States. And there's actually newspaper accounts in the Old Atlantis newspaper where Greek Americans were actually dropping the tools and trying to go on the fastest means to go and fight for the old country, so to speak. Now, let me try and... Here's the Washington Post, and it actually gives you here the actual number of troops on each side, the Army, the Navy, and so forth. And these old newspapers are worth their weight in gold with some of the information they contain. They're better than some of the things that we call newspapers today. This is from Acropolis. This is one of the main Greek newspapers, and here it's one of the battles at Balanga or something. I can't read it because I don't have my glasses in. I left them at home, which is not unusual for me to forget things. And it actually shows you here highlights of the war. The Acropolis. This actually shows you the Battle of Belestino, and this is the Greek military command sort of like surveying the area of battle here. They're formulating the battle plans. To actually show you that these are actually official documents, and these can actually be found here at Melbourne University Library in the Bayou. They're called the Papers of the Foreign Relations of the United States. They start from 1861, they go all the way through to the present time. Some are available online. You can actually get this online if you want. You use the acronym of DIGICOL, DIGICOL, and you can find these as such. And this actually shows you here, the protection of Greece in the employ of the United States. And this guy here was actually the US minister in Constantinople at the time, Terrell. So, generally speaking, the historians, These are the tools of our trade, official documents. I won't bore you anything further with I'll move on to the Balkan Wars. Russia was the instigator of the Balkan League. Okay? In 1908, the Austrians embarrassed the Russians over the what was it? Sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. But it had to do with the Balkans. Okay. So what the Russians did was they encouraged Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece to form a series of alliances, secret alliances. And of course, at that time, the Ottoman Empire was starting to be on its knees. They're having revolts in Albania, what is now modern-day Albania. And also, from 1911, they were involved in a war with Italy, the Ottoman Empire, a place called Tripoli, which is now modern-day Libya. And the Italians won that war. And it came to about September 1912 when the Italians had won the war, and it was time to actually impose their peace terms on the Turks. So this is when the Balkan League said, aha, this is our opportunity. And that's when they struck. And the first country that struck was Montenegro on October 8th, 1912. And then, of course, all the other member states all followed very, very, very quickly. And the Balkan League scored a series of very impressive military victories. Now, Greece occupies Thessaloniki in November 1912, and on the Macedonian theatre of war, that the Greeks and Bulgarians were allies, and then when the Greek army had won its battle in eastern Macedonia, they said, forward ho, all the way to Thessaloniki, because if they didn't go, the Bulgarians were going to take it over. So we actually got Thessaloniki by very short, about 3 or 4 hours. So otherwise, history of that region would have been very, very different. And of course, we all know with the Macedonian issue, where the Skopjani talk about Solun, as they term it. Now, the Bulgarians, as I said, they were not happy with the Greeks getting possession of Thessaloniki. The Ottoman army collapsed, and so they sued for an armistice. And of course, the great powers didn't want to become involved in a European war. But let me say this, that the Balkan War was in many ways a forerunner of what came in 1914-18. It was the first time that aeroplanes were used. And I've actually written an article on the Balkan Wars using the US connection, where there were some American fighters, pilots went in who wanted to go and fight for Greece at that time. So the European powers intervened, and they called all the parties to London. And they all sat around like good little people trying to sort out their problems. Finally, Greece continued with the war against the Ottoman Empire, and in February 1913, the city of Ioannina falls into Greek hands. And also in January, February 1913, there's a coup in Constantinople, where the Grand Vizier, or the Prime Minister, was actually murdered, and a new regime came into power. Because the Turks found it really quite shocking that they lost to these former subjects, people that they ruled over. And so the way they trying to find a way to try and continue the war. So finally we come to May 1913, where we see the Treaty of London signed that establishes supposedly peace between all the combatants. But in the meantime, Greece and Serbia signed a secret treaty which was actually aimed against Bulgaria, because even though they were all allies, they really distrusted one another. And the whole concentration of the Balkan Wars was the Macedonian theatre. And the Bulgarians actually hit Greece. They actually attacked Serbian and Greek positions in Macedonia, unexpectedly, so to speak. And then the combination of Serbia and Greece defeats the Bulgarians, and the Bulgarians were now in a very powerless situation. So they then asked for the intervention of the Russian Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II, and he sort of like acted as a mediator. Now, out of all this, we come to the Treaty of Bucharest, which finally establishes peace supposedly in the Balkans, where Greece and Serbia gained the lion's share of Macedonia. And of course, Crete also becomes part of Greece. And of course, some of the other islands too actually became part of Greek territory. But also, what I would want to state is that the Dodecanese, or the Ganisa, were Italian because of the Treaty of Lausanne of October 1912. And those islands did not fall into Greek possession until the end of World War II in 1947, under the Treaty of Paris. Okay? Is everything clear so far? We go to a map. That doesn't matter. That's a picture of the Turkish commander surrendering to Crown Prince Constantine, who later became the King of Greece. So this is when Salonika falls into Greek hands officially. That's a picture which shows the fall. Remember I said about Yanina falling into Greek hands? That's a picture of the Turkish side surrendering to the Greeks. Now this is the Greek army marching into Thessaloniki, victorious, and a lot of the people were very happy, as such. But there were particular groups of people like the Jewish population weren't happy with the Greek presence, because they viewed them as a threat to their trade and all that sort of stuff. Now this picture here will actually show that these are the people who actually attended the London Conference of 1912-13. Okay, and this man here is Eleftherios Venizelos, Greece's Prime Minister, who in many cases I actually admire very much. If I lived at that time, I would have been a Venizelos. I was actually thinking of coming today to dress like Venizelos, but I'm scared that I'll probably be arrested, for I've gone nuts or something, And this is how the Balkans sort of emerged at the end of the Balkan Wars and the Treaty of. So here, this part here now belongs to Greece, but at that time that actually belonged to Bulgaria. And there's a place here called Dedicatia, or what we call Alexandroupolis now. And of course, what we actually see at the end of the Balkan Wars, we also see Albania becoming an independent country. Okay? And of course, Turkey, this is what I was trying to tell you from the start, all these areas here, as far as the top line where it goes, Bosnia and Herzegovina and all that, these all belong to the Ottoman Empire. And remember when I said earlier about Austria got into a blue with the Russians in 1908? Now I remember was over Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it's good to have these maps at times too. But don't know if you could read that. I tried to make it like that. Anyway, it says here, Greeks off to war, desert hotel jobs. This is in the US. Greek Americans were just dropping their tools and trying to hop on the fastest boat and to go and fight. It is estimated between 35 to 40,000 Greek Americans dropped the tools and went to fight with the old country. Now, how many returned back to the US? That's another study which I'll look at in due time. And a lot of American businesses who employed Greeks were most unhappy. So that's Acropolis, and it says here, war declared, or declaration of war. The Balkan allies against Turkey. God blesses the Christian weapons, or weaponry on those lines. That's a very crude translation, of course, but never mind. And here it says here, this is an article from, if I can read that anyway. It's the occupation of Thessaloniki is imminent, and the Greek army crosses there, the Vada, or the what is it called? The Vada, there you go. And here we actually see the ratification of the Treaty of Bucharest, which established the peace in the Balkans. Actually, a copy of that actually can be found on microfilm here at Melbourne University. Go and have a look at the US Department of State records on Turkey. The internal one from 1910 to 29, and the political affairs of Turkey from 1910 to 29. They should have that little booklet which gives you the real number, and it gives you a description. So if you want to look all this stuff up, go and check it out. Now we come to my favourite period of Greek history, the First World War. Well, as we all know, the First World War began in Sarajevo when the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife were murdered by Princip, or whatever his name was anyway. And so once war was declared in early August 1914, the Greek Prime Minister Venizelos actually was prepared to offer Greek troops and part of the Greek Navy to help the Anglo-French. But the British said, back off. We're okay. But as the war started to drag on, because everyone thought they'd all be home by Christmas 1914, but then they started to see the stalemate on the Western Front. And so the British were trying to find a new theatre of war to knock out Turkey, because what actually happened was when the First World War began, Turkey was supposedly neutral, but it had signed a secret treaty with Germany, because the Germans had big interests in the Ottoman Empire. They were very influential, and secretly they also shipped off a large amount of gold to the Turks as well. Then finally, the Turks' supposed neutrality was shattered. So in late October 1914, they attacked Russian naval positions on the Black Sea. And then when that happens, the gloves are off. Until that time, the great powers, Anglo-French in other words, and the Russians were prepared to leave the Ottoman Empire as is. But once they entered the war, they're going to say, we're going to divide your empire to shreds when the war finishes, whatever that is. And so the Greek Prime Minister Venizelos writes 3 crucial memoranda to King Constantine and tells him, Your Highness, Your Majesty, or whatever you want to call him, this is an opportunity for us to fight with the Allies. And it is also for us a great reward to gain Asia Minor, because also there were Greeks living there. You remember when I talked to you about the Megali there? There was a large Greek population living in what is then modern day Turkey, or then it was called the Ottoman Empire. So Venizelos jumped on this to try and bring all these people under Megali Lava, the big Greece. That the king sort of said, okay, that sounds okay. And then he changes his mind. And one of the things I wish to emphasise, that the king's wife, Sophia, Queen Sophia, was actually the sister of the German Kaiser. So the Kaiser was Constantine's brother-in-law. And actually King Constantine actually believed that the Central Powers, when I mean the Central Powers, I mean Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and of course the Ottoman Empire, that they would actually win the war. So he wanted basically to keep Greece out of the conflict. Now, when we start to hear about in February, March 1915, the plans being laid for the Gallipoli campaign, okay? Venizelos did offer Greek troops and the Greek Navy. And if the Greek Navy had to come in, there may not have been a Gallipoli campaign. So the king was very reluctant. So what he does to sort of cool things down, he gets former prime ministers in a Crown Council, and they have a couple of meetings to sort of argue to go to war or not to war on the side of the Allies, Anglo-French. In the end, he says, no, we are not going to war. We're going to remain neutral. And then he dismisses Venizelos as his prime minister. Then he appoints a bunch of flunkies, you know, who really just basically were the office boys doing his bidding. We have elections in June 1915, which the Venizelos win overwhelmingly. At that time, Serbia was being hit from all sides, from the Germans and from the Austro-Hungarians. So what Venizelos did was to try and get Greece into the war. He gives the okay to the Anglo-French to land Marines, troops, in Thessaloniki. And the reason why they were landed there was to try to go supposedly to Serbia's aid, because Greece, remember I said Greece had a 1913 treaty? That's what Venizelos wanted to do, that Greece had this 1913 treaty which it had to honour. Again, the king, when he heard about this, he said to Venizelos, "Πάρε τα παπούτσια σου, and off you go. I don't want you to be Prime Minister." So the British were saying, this now complicates our situation here. What do we do? Okay, we'll offer Greece Cyprus as an inducement to come to our side, because also too, during the course of 1915, the Anglo-French were also telling the Bulgarians, they were offering them to come on their side, but then the Bulgarians dropped and went over with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. So the Bulgarians finally attacked the Serbs. So the gloves are off there. So the British offer Cyprus. So the king said, "Okay, I'll think about it." And then again, we lost that. So you can imagine that if we had Cyprus at that time, we might not have had the so-called Cyprus question of today. So the king actually refused that. Now, here comes the act of betrayal. And in June 1916, a combined Bulgarian-German force is allowed to enter Greek territory at a place called Fort Rupel in eastern Macedonia. Apparently, I've seen maps of it, apparently that Fort Rupel was sort of on a hill, and you could see right into the distance. It was a strategic fort. They were allowed to come in, and why do I say an act of betrayal? But because the king said that Greece is neutral. Well, if you're neutral, then why are you allowing the enemy to enter onto your territory? Well, of course, you also had the Anglo-French there as well. And so after that, what do we see? The Allies were trying to figure out how can we punish Greece, royalist Greece, for this. And also Venizelos was very pissed off as well. So what Venizelos does to try and get Greece onto the Allied side, he decides to form his own government, a provisional one, Stiv Thessaloniki. So from September 1916 until June 1917, Greece had two governments: the royalist government in Athens and the provisional government of Venizelos in Thessaloniki. And one of the reasons the Allies were somewhat ambivalent whether to support Venizelos or not, because they were hoping somewhere along the way that the two would actually make up and bring Greece into the war on the Anglo-French side. But that never eventuated, because the king wanted to maintain his neutrality. In the meantime, from September until late November, the Anglo-French were actually asking Constantine to hand over certain mountain batteries. In other words, heavy guns that could be used against them on the Macedonian front. But the king, played his usual double game, and then finally, to force the king to make a decision, the Anglo-French land Marines in Athens, and that's called the Battle of Athens, where a number of French Marines were actually killed and wounded. But the French elephant never forgot that, and I'll come to that later on when I come to Asia Minor. So once that happened, the Allies, then the British then blockade royalist Greece, and then eventually the French wanted the king out, and the Brits wanted to transfer some of their troops out of the Middle East to the Western Front and to other theatres of war. So after a bit of argy-bargy, because I've got the cabinet documents on this, they finally said, okay, the French tell the Brits, you can move your troops where you want to, but you give us a free hand to actually tell King Constantine to get out or we'll blow him out. So Jonard, who was the French ambassador, let's say, he goes to the palace and he tells the king, Your Majesty, pack your bags and leave. Otherwise, we'll blow you out. So the king went into exile, and he took some of his Hakul theology as well, some of his followers as well. So he went into exile for the next 3 years or so. In July, Venizelos comes. He goes to Crete, and then he comes to Athens on board a French warship, and he unites Greece. And then Greece declares war on the Central Powers, Germany and so on. And also, what we also see is the King Constantine's son, King Alexander, becomes the Greek king. And he was very popular with the people, and also he worked very well with Eleftherios Venizelos. One thing that I remember, just to hark back to the Balkan Wars, the Greek king at that time was King George of Greece, the first. He was actually assassinated in Thessaloniki. He decided to go for a walk, and this guy comes and goes bang, 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 and that was the end of him. And that's when crowned Prince Constantine became the king of Greece. So I thought I'd throw that in. That's free, by the way. Can you see that? Well, anyway, this document actually shows you here that it says here, it is reported on good authority that Greek PM thinks Greece should commence war for the Allies and send troops to the Dardanelles. And there is one State Department document which is held here in the Bailey Library, in the bargain basement, which I call as such. And 2 weeks before the Gallipoli landing by the Anzacs, the Ottoman Empire rounded up over 20,000 Greeks who lived in the towns and villages on the Gallipoli Peninsula and and shipped them off into Anatolia or Asia Minor. And of course, many of them, as you know, have never seen anything. See here, and see here, the king unexpectedly declares inability to accept the program of Venizelos, and the latter resigns at once. Athens stunned, because a lot of the Greek politicians actually wanted war. But there was one Greek politician at that time, future dictator Metaxas, who actually, when Venizelos wrote his 3 memoranda, he warned Venizelos that if we go into Asia Minor, we're going to encounter a very hostile population. We are a small power. We don't have the financial resources or the army to march into inland Turkey. And of course, I'll explain that later on. So in a way, it was really quite prophetic what we said. So there you are. That's a State Department document, which shows there Constantine's application and his son to taking over the throne. That's King Constantine. Oh, sorry, no, wrong. That's King Constantine. Next one. That's Eleftherios Venizelos. That's the provisional government in Thessaloniki. And that's the actual administration of Venizelos in Thessaloniki. And these are just newspaper articles of the time. You've got a very, very good newspaper collection here on microfilm here. And of course, if you're students here, you should be able to access some of these electronic databases as such. Okay. Now this is my favourite period of history because this is the area which I have specialised, and this is the area that I write most of my academic pieces and also newspaper pieces for the Greek American paper, the National Herald. At the end of the war, the First World War, the victorious powers, Great Britain, France, Italy, the United States, Greece, Serbia, etc., all met in Paris to hammer out a peace treaty against the countries that started the war, against Germany and the Ottoman Empire, etc., etc. So from the Greek perspective, Eleftherios Venizelos presented the Greek territorial case on February 3 and 4, 1919. And he said, for example, I want Smyrna, I want Papadakisa, I want Imbros and Tenedos and whatever, and Cyprus. But he argued, he said, I would like to have Cyprus, but it's really, we hope that Britain, out of the generosity of its heart, would actually give us Cyprus. But he knew that the Brits wouldn't give it because Cyprus was part of the British strategic chain of command from Gibraltar, right across the eastern Mediterranean, down to the Red Sea and up to its Indian Empire, what's called the lines of strategic lines of communication. He also thought about Constantinople because it was part of the Byzantine Empire. But there were international interests at stake, so he backed that off. And actually, this is quite interesting. There was even discussion throughout 1919 to make Constantinople an international city. And also there was even rumours of that becoming the seat, like they say in New York, the United Nations. They wanted that to be the seat of the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was actually President Woodrow Wilson's brainchild. So after Venizelos, delivered his territorial claims, but then the great powers formed what was called the Greek Territorial Committee. And out of that, there were 2 delegates of each. 2 from Great Britain, 2 from France, 2 from the United States, and 2 from Italy. But when Venizelos actually presented his territorial claims on 3rd and 4th and like that, Japan was there, but Japan did not sit on the Greek Territorial Commission. So there was a series of interviews and so on. And then finally, I think it was around March 8, 1919, they delivered their findings. The Anglo-French argued that Greece should have Smyrna, but the Americans and the Italians argued against that. In the meantime, the Italians were landing Italian troops in southwestern Turkey, places like Marmaris, or it was otherwise known as Halikarnassus and so forth. And the other allies, Britain, France, the United States, were pretty annoyed by that. And so Venizelos kept whispering in the ear of the British and the French and the Americans. He said, look, you know, the Italians are doing what they're doing is wrong. And also where Smyrna is, in that area there's a lot of Greeks living there. And I fear for their lives. So in early May 1919, the big three, Woodrow Wilson, the US President, Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, and Georges Clemenceau, the French Premier, they give the green light for Greece to land in Smyrna. The Italians were actually kept out because they really didn't trust them. And also too, the Italians were after a place called Fiume, which is up north on the Adriatic Sea. And then finally the Italians actually came in. So in the night time of May 14, 1919, Greek ships with troops leave Thessaloniki and Piraeus and head east to Smyrna. Now, I tried to imagine what it could have been like at that time. Here you are, a guy, a person living, in Smyrna, and you see these ships coming in. And it must have been a wonderful day for these people there. At last, we are going to be free of Ottoman rule. Our liberators are coming. And of course, they landed here and they marched through the streets and they're probably waving flags and, they're all singing, the Greek national anthem and whatever. As the Greek troops are actually marching down on the streets of Smyrna, gunfire broke out. Now, no one knows exactly who fired this gunfire. And so the Greek troops actually opened fire in return. And then mayhem and chaos actually happened. And what actually happened was Turkish businesses were looted, the Turks were killed, and so forth, and of course some Greeks were killed as well. When this news filtered back to Paris, where Venizelos was, the Anglo-French started thinking, I think we made a bad decision here. We shouldn't have sent these people. Maybe we should have gone there. They show that they're very undisciplined. But Venizelos argued and said, give us a chance. And in the meantime, the Brits, the French and the Americans formed an international commission to investigate what would happen in Smyrna. And in October 1919, they delivered their report, and it was most unfavourable to Greece. But Venizelos argued very strenuously that Greece must remain in Smyrna. So they said, okay, we'll stay. Okay. So fast forward to February, March 1920. In London, the great powers, minus the United States, decide to impose their peace terms on Turkey. After that, at San Remo in April of 1920, they basically reconfirmed what they did in London a few months earlier. And so out of that emerges the Treaty of Sevres. And basically, you remember I talked about the Megali there, the great idea? Greece of 2 continents and 5 seas. That's what it was. There are maps that show η Ελλάδα από 2 υπήρους και 5 θάλασσες. We got that. That's what the Treaty of Sevres was. But all that vanished in October of 1920. King Alexander decided to take a stroll in the palace gardens of Patoi. He's marching down like that. He hears rustling in the trees or something. He goes and investigates and sees it was a monkey. And this monkey actually bit him. And he died from that. He died from septicemia. And so, if I want to be tongue-in-cheek here, we lost Asia Minor because due to a monkey bite. So when the king died, during the course of 1920, the royalists were supposedly persecuted, but they were actually clamouring for elections. So Venizelos said, that's why you go? Okay, we'll call elections. End of story. So he calls elections in early November 1920. Most of the great powers actually believed that the Venizelos would win overwhelmingly. Much to the surprise, the royalists win in a landslide. And so Venizelos goes into exile. In the meantime, the royalists decide to have a referendum. And they put it to the people, do you want Constantine to come back? Yay or nay? The overwhelming majority of the people said, nah, we want him. Okay, you want him back? Okay. So the Anglo-French said, okay, so you're calling back this guy that gave us a lot of trouble in World War I. Okay. Remember I said about the French elephant? Well, when the French got a wind that he won the plebiscite, he was going to come back, they pushed very hard for the Treaty of Sèvres to be modified, to be changed. And they fought really hard for that. But the Brits were always, they were sort of like playing their own double game here. Because even though they may not have liked Constantine, but Constantine was better than the Turkish Sultan. So finally, we fast forward to February, March 1921 in London, and there we see the modifications to the Treaty of Sèvres. And of course, you know, the Greeks actually said, we don't really accept this. We may accept a few things out of all this treaty here, but we want to continue the struggle in Asia Minor. But behind the scenes, Lloyd George was actually encouraging the Greeks to attack the Turks. And then after the conference finished, the Greek army attacked Turkish positions and they suffered a loss. And so then, of course, you know, then you start to think, and then the Brits were probably saying, I think we've backed the wrong horse here. So, but in the meantime, after that defeat, the Greek army begins to sort of begin to add more troops, more weapons, and so forth. And so in July 1921, then the Greek army begins its assault in Asia Minor. It scores a series of impressive victories against the Turkish nationals, and they push further and further into Asia Minor. And if you want to destroy your enemy, you occupy its capital city. Because at that time, Turkey had, like Greece in World War I, had two rival governments. You had the official government of the Sultan, under the control of the Anglo-French, and the unofficial government of Mustafa Kemal, or Ataturk, in Ankara, or Angora, as it was known then. So if you see documents, you see the word Angora, it was the then name of Ankara, Ankara as we call it today. So what the Turkish nationalist plan was like a spider's web. Draw them further and further and further away from their main base of communications from Smyrna. So when you extend the lines of communication, then you start to weaken. And so in September of 1921, a fierce battle raged on the outskirts of Ankara. At one stage it looked as if the Greeks were going to get the upper hand. And then a couple of minutes later the Turks would counter-attack. Then finally the Turks pushed the Greeks back and the Greeks held the Afyonkarahisar that defensive line. And that was a stalemate. And so in the meantime, the Allies said, well, it's time to intervene again. So in March of 1922, they meet in Paris and they hammer out an agreement where the Greeks would would offer an armistice and withdraw. But the Turks the Turkish nationalists under Kemal said no, no armistice. We want the Greeks to go, and then we'll sign the armistice and all that. So the Turks were playing for time. So the Greeks decided in late July 1922 to threaten to occupy Constantinople. And when the Anglo-French heard about this, they said, well, if you try to do that, well, you know, we British are the major naval power. We can actually come up and bomb Piraeus. So the Greeks backed off. And it's quite interesting that the British High Commissioner at the time, Sir Horace Rumbold, actually believed that the Greeks were 50% bluffing and 50% for action. So if we had the chance, they could have actually marched into like that, but Greece was almost on its knees. It was really backwards. So in August of 1922, late August 1922, the Turkish nationalists, without any fanfare, great secrecy, they launched their final offensive against the Greek positions on that line I mentioned, Afyonkarahisar, Eskişehir. And so the Greek army starts to retreat. As it retreated, it did what's called scorched earth. They burned Turkish villages and so on. So when it comes to history, we also have to tell the truth, as much as we may not like it. Yes, the Greeks did do horrible things, because there's always two sides to a story. So finally, the Greek army comes into Smyrna, and when in early September 1922, when information filters back to London that the Greeks are about to collapse, the then British Prime Minister Lloyd George and his Foreign Secretary Lord Curzon, we don't believe that. That's unbelievable. How can they do that? Yes, because the Greek army was on its last legs, and then they leave Asia Minor. In the meantime, in the port of Smyrna, in the harbour there, on the quay there, you see thousands and thousands of Greeks and Armenians there trying to leave. In the meantime, Allied warships come in, British, French, American, Italian, but they weren't taking Greeks, they were only taking their own nationals. And so imagine if I can use this table here. This is the key, the prokimenos, we say, Smyrna, okay? So the Greek refugees were actually on this thing. So on either side they had fire. On September 13th, the city of Smyrna was actually torched and burned to a crisp. In the meantime, there was an order given by Nuruddin Pasha, who was the governor of Smyrna after the catastrophe, that all males 17 to 45 were to be detained and shipped off into Asia Minor. That's an article which I wrote, and part of that article is a forthcoming publication which I sent to Femi. And then once that happened, we have an armistice at Budani, which then opens the way for the Luzon conference. In the meantime, during the after the Mudanya discussions and the armistice, then we see thousands of Greeks from Eastern Thrace leaving to go into Greece. At that time, Greece maybe had about, say, 4.5 million people. It had an instantaneous population increase of over 1 million plus people. So it went from about 4.5 to nearly 5.5, maybe 6 million. All these people coming from Asia Minor and from Eastern Thrace. And so Greece had a refugee problem of mammoth proportions, beyond its financial resources to cope. So if we think here in Australia that we've had a few refugees, or we call illegals, that's chicken food. We had over 1 million plus people coming in such a short time. It was beyond the resources, so Greece sought international help. And thank goodness, and I say this with thank goodness to the American Red Cross and to the Near East Relief and to the other non-government bodies that help Greece through that very tragic time. Because September 1922 to me is the blackest period in modern Greek history. When we lose 3 millennia of the Greek presence in Asia Minor. Now fast forward to Luzon. Luzon went into 2 periods. It started around November 20, 1922, and finished early February 1923. What were the main things for Greece? Well, the issue of exchanging populations, well, they had already left anyway. So even if they were there, they couldn't return back to their ancestral homelands. There were already refugees, there were already Greeks who had to be kicked out eventually anyway. But the bulk of them had already left. And also the issue of the patriarchy, of the patriarch. The Turks wanted to remove the patriarchate, lock, stock and barrel, out. But the French argued very strongly and said, no, the patriarch can remain here as a religious leader, but let's trim his political influence. So that's what, and also Venizelos actually said that we can't do that, because if you do that, we may threaten you with war. And also at that stage, one aspect from an Australian perspective, the Turks actually talked about digging up the Anzac graves. And the then Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes actually said, if you do that, that's a casus belli, that's a cause for war. And so when the Turks got that, they backed off, because they knew the fighting qualities of the Australian soldier in World War I at Gallipoli. But it was the French who kept egging on the Turks, procrastinate, drag things on, drag it on. So the Turks said, okay, we're going home. So they all went their ways. So in April 1923 until July 1923, that was the second phase. For Greece, it wasn't that important. For Greece, the only thing that the Turks pressed really hard, they wanted reparations. But Venizelos told Ismet Pasha, listen, Ismet, I know that we did the things that you were suggesting and all that, but we're a poor country. We have all these refugees. How are we going to take care of them? We don't have the money. No, you've got to pay something. You must pay something. You know, you did all this damage to my country, so you have to pay. Is it not a metakarasu? Are you out of your mind? So Venizelos said, okay, are you going? So that's the game you play. Well, we will leave. He actually played the bluff here, Venizelos, but the Greek army in the meantime was actually being reinforced in Western Thrace. And so Venizelos actually said, okay, that's the way out. We're actually going home, and the Greek army is ready to march into Constantinople. It was really serious. I mean, it could have been a potential conflict. So Ismet Pasha said, well, we don't want a war, because we've been fighting now for almost 10 years. So he sends a series of telegrams to his boss in Smyrna, and says, Mr. Mustafa, what shall I do? He said, okay, let's back off. Let's back off. And thank goodness for that, common sense ruled. And so what Greece did was, as a token gesture, they gave him a piece of strategic land and a railway line and all that in a place called the Karagash. And that's also part of the Luzon Treaty as well. So Articles 37 to 45 of the Luzon Treaty cover the minority rights of the Greeks and so forth. Now, what does this all mean? What I've discovered, or what I've told you today, is that there are a couple of things that emerge. One, we see the Greek state expanding and contracting a little bit. The Luzon Treaty has established the borders that Greece has today. And it's governed the relationship between its neighbour, Turkey, and Greece. Of course, there's been a bit of argy-bargy over the last decades or so. The other thing too is that the idea of the Megali there was put to rest at Lausanne. So any idea, because I know that there are Greeks today who dream about Constantinople coming back to us. Well, in my view, and this is just a personal view, and I'm not speaking to you from a historical perspective, is it really worth all those body bags? And, you know, for the Hagia Sophia? And a lot of people say, oh, you know, the Hagia Sophia has become, you know, a mosque or a museum. I'd rather that being a mosque or a museum rather than being torn down. Because that's what's happened with some of the churches in Cyprus. They become stables and horses and stuff like that. So at least it's not worth it. So that's where I'm going to conclude. And I'm willing to take any questions you want to throw at me. Thank you very much. Yes.
Do we have time for a couple of questions? Then?
Yeah, go ahead. You mind if I sit down?
Go for it.
Thank you.
The royal family today, is there anything left over, and do they still control anything, or is their influence still sort of seen? I know they have Pedicures here in Melbourne, don't they? They own a couple of buildings and stuff like that. Who's left from the royal family? What do they do?
The only one that I know that's alive is King Constantine, but the second. He was king until 1967 when he was kicked out, when the military coup happened in April 1967, the colonels took over. And then in late 1967 he tried to stage a counter coup, which failed, and then he went into exile. So he's basically lived in France and England as such, and of course some of his kids have married into other royal families. See, all the royal families in Europe, they're all interrelated, they're all interconnected. And their great-grandmother is actually Queen Victoria, in many cases. I mean, if you take the First World War, the Tsar Nicholas, the Kaiser, and the King George, they're all first cousins. And the grandmother was Queen Victoria. And they hated each other's guts, you know, despite being first cousins. But to talk about the king, in 1973 or 72, they held a referendum in Greece, and they asked the people, the colonels asked very clearly in a referendum, do you want the monarchy, yay or nay? And the people said, no. So basically, Constantine has tried to go back to Greece as a Glücksburg, because they're actually of Danish extraction, the Greek monarchy, the second part, because the first king of Greece was King Othon, but he came from Bavaria, one of the Germanic states. But as far as I know now, that King Constantine is basically a private citizen. So he has no influence. Although I'm sure there are people in Greece who dream of actually having the monarchy back.
I want to back up with the second question. We talked a little bit about that sort of geopolitical strategy that I know we sort of looked at at another lecture. What does Greece offer in terms of, you know, strategy or where it's located that's so useful for other countries? We talk about the big powers.
Well, firstly, Greece is the gateway to southeastern Europe, okay? Especially the Thessaloniki. Now, I'd like to hark back to the early 20th century. In the late 20th century, Austria-Hungary and Russia were vying for influence in the Balkans. And Thessaloniki was seen basically as the gateway. Whoever got that Thessaloniki control into southeastern Europe, the Balkans, the other parts of the Balkans. And when it fell to Greece, well, that was good for us. You see, Greece is at the crossroads between the east and west. We occupy a very, very important geostrategic position. So it's not because they love us or anything like that. It's just that we occupy that. We are it's like Turkey. Turkey is the land bridge between Europe and Eurasia. So Greece is the gateway into Europe from the Mediterranean. We are the first country in the Mediterranean from the European perspective. Yes.
From that perspective, could you argue that that's the reason why there might be an incentive to lend money and put Greece in debt, or there might be some sort of conspiracy theory going on?
I'm not going to buy into conspiracy theories. I don't know. I couldn't answer that.
Yeah, okay.
the only thing that I can tell you is from my readings that Greece has accumulated huge debts in its almost 200-year history, and they've bankrupted a number of times, and that's why I said they had the International Financial Commission, which actually finished its biddings not that many decades ago. I think it was around 1975 that it stopped. Yes.
I was going to say, how would you compare the economic catastrophe of Greece nowadays versus medieval times? And are we comparing the two refugee crises that happened and are currently happening? Are we well equipped, better equipped now to handle this one, or were we better equipped back then to handle the previous one?
I don't think we haven't advanced at all. That's why I said. Greece can't cope with all these refugees coming from Syria, from the Middle Eastern conflicts. They're two different time periods. Because for a start, it says the refugees that Greece gained in 1922 or in other conflicts, they were mainly Christians, whereas the vast majority of these people coming from the other countries are mainly Muslim. Now, for me, I don't care what your religion is. Okay, I'll be very clear on that. So it's a different situation, because also too, let's not forget that now we've got the European Union. Well, the European Union didn't exist at that time. It was a series of nation states, all at each other's throats. And of course, in terms of a financial list, nothing's really changed as far as I'm concerned. I mean Greece, defaulted a number of times during the 19th century. So what's new? Yeah.
Do you know the vast majority of reasons why Greece got into so much debt? Because that is quite alarming that it's gone bankrupt so many times in 200 years.
Well, I suppose as a small country, it lacked the financial resources, and probably its taxation system wasn't really great, and I'm sure like then, like now, they weren't paying their taxes as they should. I mean, I know of stories of people who've told me that there were doctors in Greece claiming that they only earned €13,000 a year, and they were declaring themselves poor. And so when the tax people from Athens went to investigate, they had swimming pools and tennis courts. So must be doing all right now on €13,000. Yes.
So on that point, was there ever actually a period of time where Greece was economically prosperous?
I would say for me, probably one of the best from my readings of modern Greek history. When Charillus Trikoupis was prime minister in the late 19th century, he borrowed money, but he used it for capital works like railroads and so forth. And also under Venizelos as well. They borrowed money, but it was also used to improve the infrastructure of the country as well. But Greece has always had a problem because, look, it's basically a one-product economy at that time. It was an agrarian society, and it wasn't like say the United States or Australia or Britain, where it was mechanised. A lot of it was hard labour.
We did have a sort of golden period of production, and it even like I think today that Greece is generating a lot of really interesting products, but not a lot of the world knows about it. Is there maybe a big gap between businesses and what the government's doing to support them, and what they want to export and what they want to show the world? Because there's big automotive, technology happening, and big sort of agricultural. They used to build tractors and stuff like that. They used to build some of the best cars in the world. They also used to build some of the best refrigerators as well. But not much of the world knew about that. Is there a schism again between businesses and the government, or?
Possibly. It's a good.
Because it's not part of the brand. Whereas Italy, like we know about their economic boom and what they've done for building and industry, but it's just not part of the Greek brand, so to speak. So where's it lacking?
Maybe the Greek government should get off its backside and actually support its businesses. I'm not into business side.
Yeah, sure.
But it's a good point that you raised. Good, because I mean, you go to the supermarket and you see a lot of excellent. I've never heard in all my life, and you guys, Greek, you disagree. You go to the supermarket and you go and buy Greek produce from the supermarket shelf, and you've never heard of someone dying of food poisoning or like that. It's, you know, it's top quality stuff. And you know, even Greece makes some brilliant wines, but you never hear of them. You know, all we hear is Australian wines, which are excellent, and also Californian wines. They're very good as well. But you know, Greece has been making wines long before these two countries were ever thought of or existed. You know, and we don't promote it.
They had an interesting segment on 3XY about that yesterday. It was on the 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. show, and I think they said something about the Greek government's only supporting the export of very traditional, old-fashioned wines, like the Assyrtiko from Santorini and one of the ones from Nemea and stuff like that. They're not really pushing out the different kinds of brands. So maybe they're stuck in that little hole where they think it's all about what used to be and the few products they have, and they're not really willing to be as ambitious with the new products they have to offer. They're not supporting enough of the business. So, I don't know.
We need to be adventurous.
Yeah.
Rather than be stagnant. Because, speaking personally, I really worry about the future of Greece. It's not looking good in my view. You know, and I'm not talking about the influx of all these tragic people that come in seeking a better life for themselves and escaping conflict from their own countries. But I don't think these Greek governments, I don't care if they're PASOK, New Democracy or cities are, they're not really doing anything to help the country. I mean, we are more Greeks than what they are. I mean, like for example, most of us in here know something about the Stoyanov issue. And myself, I don't like this precipice agreement. At least temporarily bring some measure of an end to the stalemate. But I think it may create bigger problems down the track, which I don't know how they're going to unfold. Because one of the things that of course I couldn't mention because I was going about 100 miles an hour through all this, but the Balkans has always been the powder keg of Europe. The First World War started from there, and also too was a terrible theatre in World War II. Any other questions I'm willing to take?
Maybe last one.
Oh yes, Let me just ask me. One thing that I didn't mention, because as I said, I hope I've given you enough information to sort of mull over. Okay, what I've given you is just the tip of the iceberg. I could speak to you on Asia Minor for about 2 hours, non-stop. But I have to try and keep it as even as I can, and hopefully make it flow all the way through. During the First World War, the Ottoman Empire got rid of its Greeks, Armenian, and Assyrian populations. The first cab off the rank in World War I were the Armenians, and then they came later on for the Greeks and for the Assyrians. So that was one of the main reasons why Venizelos was pushing very quickly for the Greek landing in Smyrna, because he was actually fearing that the Christian population there could suffer under the Turks. And of course, what was happening, remember, if you may recall, I mentioned about the Italians landing troops in Asia Minor, in southwestern Asia Minor. Well, the Italians were also stirring up the local Turkish populations as well. And also the Greek and Italian forces almost came to blows. And they're actually allies. One thing that I didn't mention, and I think this is very, very important, and this is an overhang in the 21st century. You remember that I said that during the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was neutral for a time, and the Anglo-French and the Russians said that if you don't enter the war, you have nothing to fear. But once they entered the war, that's when the gloves came off, And so the Anglo-French and the Russians talked about carving up the Ottoman Empire. And so what we see is a series of secret treaties. The first one is the Constantinople, where the Russians wanted Constantinople. Then we see later on the Sykes-Picot Agreement. That's the one that's caused all the bloody problems in today's Middle East. The Anglo-French had decided to create direct and indirect spheres of influence. Because all these countries, these Syria and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, these countries didn't exist. They were just parts of the Ottoman Empire. Yes, Saudis may have lived there, but it was part of the Ottoman Empire. There's no Saudi Arabian country or Jordan. It was called Transjordan at one time. Iraq was actually called Mesopotamia. The boundaries of the Ottoman Empire went where Persia is today, or Iran. The British created Iraq after World War I. Then, of course, you also had the promising independence to the Arabs. The British promised the independence, but for them, independence was no. You can control your affairs, but we're going to appoint advisors, political advisors, to run your economy. So in particular, the Sykes-Picot Agreement still has a big effect even today, because you see all these boundaries are like the shifting sands of Arabia. And I would encourage you, of course, a movie is a movie. It doesn't tell the whole story, the actual truth. But there's some truth in it. Try and watch Lawrence of Arabia with Peter O'Toole. It's an excellent movie.
Thank you, Stavros, for coming and speaking to us. As a consequence of the catastrophe, we know that you'd like to share.
So you can look at it. Because I can talk and rant and rave about it, but they say a picture tells 1,000 words.
And afterward, we'll come up and take a photo as well.
This is from I think from a Turkish TV. I think it's viewed as a Turkish television. This is the real record. This is some Hollywood adaptation, but this is the real record. Remember when I said the key? Imagine living through that. That's hell on earth. That's like Dante's Inferno. Greek refugees, as you're watching because it's silent, the Greek refugees were actually swimming out and climbing up on the ropes of the French ships, and they were actually cutting the ropes to prevent them from actually getting on board, and people died. And as the fire was actually taking place, you could hear the screams of women and children and old men crying for help and all that. And they had the brass bands playing to the loudest, like to drown out the cries of these poor devils, seeking assistance. This to me is probably one of the greatest tragedies of human history. You should read if you get a chance. I encourage you to go and look at the State Department documents and just read the cables going to and fro from Constantinople to London and Washington DC. Your hair stand on it. The US Consul General, George Horton, who was actually married to a Greek woman, he writes in a dispatch to the State Department, And when he left, he took as many people with him, even people who weren't Americans. He made them Americans, so he was a good man. I like George Orwell. And he writes in the dispatch, as he was leaving Smyrna, I was ashamed to be a member of the human race. That's a telling line. That as the fire was actually taking place, these Allied ships were sitting in the bloody harbour, about 15, 20 ships sitting there in the harbour there, doing nothing. When people were screaming for help. If they had fired a couple of shots over their bow, they would have backed off the canals. But there's also a record of a Japanese ship, when it heard what was taking place, went as fast as it could to Smyrna, threw its cargo into the bay, and took over 800 refugees to Piraeus. And I'm the guy who actually uncovered that ship. Not only the actual ship, the name of the ship, and the captain. No one else has done that research, and then there are people now going around doing the research, trying to claim that they've found nothing. I'm the guy who uncovered that. I found that in 2005 when I went to the US. I heard anecdotal about a Japanese ship. Oh, that sounds interesting. So I started going through all the State Department documents. I couldn't find anything of a Japanese. So it was newspaper accounts, unknown Japanese ship. Then finally I tracked through old Greek newspapers, like in Bros, I think it was, like that, and I found the name of the ship. And the name of the captain. The captain's name is actually Captain Lu, which that doesn't sound that Japanese. Maybe Chinese, I don't know. Do you want to show the other one as well? Yeah. It's only Greek, but I don't know about it. That's how the city was. I don't remember it started in the Armenian quarter, and then the wind just picked it up after that. It burned the whole European quarter, including the American consulate. And there are people that are actually deniers that I actually said that the Greeks and the Armenians taught us to like that. But there's a thing where the Turks say, Yaor Smirni, infidel Smirni. Let's expunge anything that has to do with Christians. So you see the people, trying to get out. The harbour was actually filled with dead bodies. You could basically do the miracle and walk on water as such. Either a French or Italian ship for that flag. Now some of you here may have ancestors who came from this region. Some of you may have ancestors who might come from Asia Minor at one time. So this is why they say, I've heard people say, oh, history is boring. Well, to me it isn't. And the reason why is that we human beings don't learn from the lessons of the past, because if you don't learn from the lessons of the past, what happens? You repeat them again and again and again. And that's why I encourage people, even if you don't study history here, pick up a history book. And of course, be very careful how it's written. Because, one of the things, when you get into things like genocide research, there are two schools. There are those that say it happened, and those that say it didn't happen. So you have to discern in your own mind who's telling the truth and who's trying to blind you with, or trying to deny, or trying to put weasel words to try and sort of change your thinking about it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the lecture anyway. Thank you so much.
Everyone get up for a group photo, please.
Live stream, mate, you're famous now.
Am I?